Okay, Dirty Harry and the French Connection. These two 1971 police movies sent America into a cop movie frenzy for the rest of the decade. That's right, the US made tons of cop movies during the 1970s, including, of course, the major studios. And independent filmmakers made cop movies. There were cop films of an adult nature. And cop films turned up as 1970s TV movies. And there were even hybrid cop films that crossed over into the sci-fi genre and the horror genre. But it's the 1970s American studio-made cop films that everyone remembers, as they weren't just mere retreads of Dirty Harry or The French Connection, but rather classics in their own right. In short, police characters and police stories, they penetrated every corner of pop culture in 1970s America. So it stands to reason that on the gangster side of the crime genre, that the two massive hits, The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, they must have kicked the Hollywood studios off into making an equal frenzy of mafia films, right? Right? Let's take a look. Huh. Something must have gone wrong there. Let's try that again. Okay, so if that's the case, why weren't more mafia films produced in the 70s to cash in on this craze? And it was a craze everywhere but Hollywood, seemingly. Was the actual mafia exerting pressure on the major studios? Was the Italian-American Civil Rights League? And were those sometimes the same thing? But more interestingly, in this vacuum left by no studio mafia movies, what fearless Americans did pick up the camera and the piano wire and tell these tough, violent stories on the big screen during the 70s. This is the story of the low-budget, independent, sometimes regional filmmakers who tackled a subject in the 1970s that the studios almost dared not touch. So as I was saying, the 6 films which we're going to be discussing...
Wait. Are we really sure that the U.S. studios produced only 2 Godfathers and that other one?
Oh, The Dawn is Dead?
Yeah. During the 70s? What about something like Mean Streets?
Well, good question. Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets was released by Warner Brothers in 1973, yes. But, I don't know. It really concerns street-level neighborhood guys, their night lives, their love lives, their sex lives, even their spiritual lives. It's only the couple of scenes where Harvey Keitel meets with his uncle that it feels remotely like an organized crime film. So, no, I don't think we should count that.
Okay, what about that other one I remember called The Valachi Papers?
Well, I'd see how you think that would count, because that was released by Columbia Pictures in 1972, and it was about the famous mob informant Joe Valachi, and it's an important film, as it dared to say the words La Cosa Nostra, whereas The Godfather shied away from that term, caving under pressure from the Italian-American Civil Rights League. But the Valachi Papers was actually Italian-made, European-financed, produced by Italian legend Dino De Laurentiis, interior shot in Rome, Charles Bronson surrounded by a European supporting cast who were dubbed into English. Columbia just brought it over as an import. So, no, we're not counting that one either. But actually, that's part of the reason nobody realizes how few Hollywood mafia films were made in the 70s, because the Italians, not Italian Americans, but actual Italian filmmakers in Italy, were famous for being cinematic copycats. And they just cranked out the crime films in the 70s. Crime films that could have the word Godfather slipped into the title. Even one with a Marlon Brando look-alike. Back in America, the studio disinterest was strange because The Godfather was a phenomenon for Paramount, allowing the studio to negotiate a special percentage with cinema owners and sending the stock of the studio's parent company soaring. The original novel stayed on the bestsellers list for 67 weeks, and Puzo banged out a book about writing the book just to cash in on the mania. But it was mainly the independents who took on the syndicate, and believe it or not, they even beat Paramount to the punch. See, because Puzo had made his deal with Paramount in 1968, before the book was even published in 1969, it both created a big public anticipation, and it gave competitors a long lead time. And perhaps not surprisingly, it was the quickie porno industry that got the first film out to market. Yeah, The Godson was released in 1971, the year before The Godfather. It began life as a softcore project about a hitman, but when financing got rocky, writer-director William Rotsler was asked if his Blue Hitman script could be shaped more into a Blue Mafia script. See, there was a lot of buzz about this upcoming Godfather thingy. What resulted is a film about an ambitious West Coast mafioso who oversees a house of prostitution for the organization. This mafia soldier begins to use the working women in manipulative ways in his ascent to becoming a capo. Now, I don't want to go all identity politics on you and imply that only Italo-Americans can play Italo-Americans, but when the only Italian name in the cast is Mario Santini, and when that turns out to be a pseudonym for Keith Erickson, well, it's clear that these were outsiders to this culture. And they're also outsiders to the mainstream film world. So who were the folks behind The Godson exactly? Well, believe it or not, they were sci-fi people. Writer-director William Rotsler wrote licensed Star Trek books and was known as the person who gave the Uhura character her official first name. And The Godson was filmed at the swanky pad of legendary sci-fi writer Harlan Ellison, author of the City on the Edge of Forever Star Trek episode. Less sci-fi, but equally interesting, is the case of Deborah Maguire, who appeared in the prestigious role of Black Hooker, and then went on to marry Richard Pryor. Following the next year in 1972, with some actual overlap with The Godfather's theatrical run, was, you guessed it, The Goddaughter. Different adult filmmakers this time with a more comedic tone. After all, one young lady rigs her nether regions to shoot a horny mobster in the face. In fact, it could almost be considered an early porn parody, with the Mafia wardrobe only a step above Party City costumes. It's actually so cheap that it makes The Godson look like frickin' Cleopatra, and seriously, really makes you appreciate how The Godson was trying to be a tough Mafia actioner, just with a liberal sprinkling of sex. Now, around the same time, a non-Mafia film was being made, a low-budget political thriller called No Place to Hide. It starred two unknown actors, a guy named Sylvester Stallone and a guy named Tony Page. When that film was done, one of the writers was shifting over to producing movies, and his next film was going to be an independent Mafia film, a film called Family Honor. It was suggested that Stallone and Page both audition for a villain role. Well, Stallone ended up getting no part at all, and Page was cast not as a villain, but as the lead. Apparently, his real-life criminal background and 7 years of incarceration, well, those were the big selling points. And was he not only an ex-crook, but also connected, if you know what I mean? Did that insulate the production from...
Yeah, hello.
You are... Wait, you're taking a phone call during our shoot here?
Yeah, I'm glad I did. It was just a voice saying, we're gonna shut you down unless you quit ratting.
Unless we quit ratting. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard.
Yeah. Well,
Nobody's gonna. Look, I'm armed. Nobody's gonna do anything. I'm game to keep going if you guys are, right?
yes.
Okay, so back to Family Honor. The film concerns a cop who is pressured to avenge the mob assassination of his father, who was also a cop. Now, this might sound like a police film, but it doesn't play that way at all. The revenge is being pushed by the cop's very Sicilian mother, who wants an old-school Italian vendetta. In the supporting cast is Leslie West from the band Mountain, playing a mob henchman. Now, you might think he was cast for his rock stardom or his friendship with someone in the movie, and those were both true. But Leslie West apparently used to hang out with both Jimi Hendrix and Mafia soldier John Roberts together, and one of West's first regular gigs was at a mob-owned club called the Action House. So just assume that anyone in the entertainment industry back then had some experience with organized crime. In fact, given the rampant rumors of the mob infiltration of show business during that period, it's surprising that we're only discussing 6 Mafia films today. From all the reading I've done, they didn't mind seeing their stories on the screen. They usually just wanted the names changed. Family Honor director Clark Warswick was more of an international photographer than a movie guy, making only a single other commercial feature, Agent on Ice, more than a decade later. One wonders if his first film ever had a chance to be a mainstream hit, or whether it was meant more for people who actually lived that life. After all, the movie was made and exhibited in cooperation with the Fortune Society, an organization devoted to keeping productive people out of jail, with the society even handing pamphlets out at some of the screenings. Family Honor was filmed primarily in the Bronx, with a climax that looks as if it was shot in the Meadowlands of New Jersey, an area famous as the mob's dumping ground for dead bodies. In fact, the Meadowlands were, for decades, the educated guess as to Jimmy Hoffa's final resting place. It won't be the only film we discuss today that has a climax in that famous marshy region of the Garden State.
Okay, I've been on my phone browsing this whole time, and I see a film called Honor Thy Father, also from 1973. What about that one?
TV movie, was not made for the big screen. We're not going to count that one.
Yeah, is it any good?
Well, it's a docudrama told with a dry, robotic narration like this. But it's based on the New York Mafia's so-called Banana Wars that ended in 1968, just 5 years prior. And, you know, that kind of raises a good point. Because when I talk to my colleagues about why the studios didn't make more Mafia films in the 70s, they say, well, The Godfather was a period film. Maybe the studios felt like they would have had to make more period gangster movies, and that can get expensive. But that idea to me has never held water. Because not only was The Dawn is Dead contemporary to the 1970s, but also the 5 families of New York were constantly fighting each other in real life during that decade. Like Crazy Joe Gallo getting shot to death at Umberto's Clam House in 1972. Now, filmmakers in Italy, they were quick to use a rip straight from the headlines approach, and I feel like the US studios too could have done that. Again, unless there were secret pressures not to. In any case, the next independent big-screen Mafia film was 1974's Massacre Mafia Style. Its director and star, Duke Mitchell, was born Dominique Salvatore Michele, making this the most authentically Italian-American of the Godfather-inspired films up to this point. Now, Duke Mitchell had been making his living as a nightclub singer when he saw The Godfather, and even though he had won some admiration from industry big shots, he was getting a bit worn out by his profession. And Duke, who was a rule-breaking maverick in every sense of the word, saw a lot of his culture in Coppola's film, although reports conflict as to whether he loved or hated the portrayal. But on some level, it clearly connected with him. And for crying out loud, The Godfather had a crooner, and that crooner wanted to get into movies. So Duke was inspired to make his own crime film, and he seemed to be trying to outdo The Godfather in the brutality department. Massacre Mafia Style is the story of a Sicilian mobster who moves to Los Angeles to muscle in on the local rackets. It has a tremendous body count, and it has some outrageous executions, like a pimp being crucified, literally crucified, on Easter Day. The film basically alternates between these killing sprees and some really heartfelt monologues, and Duke tackles both with equal passion. Even though Massacre Mafia Style could be viewed as just another Godfather cash-in, this film clearly comes from a place of love and genuine enthusiasm from Duke Mitchell. To get the film done, Duke worked with novice filmmakers, and he doubled Los Angeles locations for Sicilian ones, but he did manage to get singer Vic Caesar and character actor George Buck Flower in the cast, so he did get some minor names. And the acting, it's on par for an exploitation film, no better, no worse. Now, the film was shot as Like Father, Like Son. It reached its widest release as Massacre Mafia Style, and it later made it onto VHS as The Executioner in the 1980s. Massacre Mafia Style must have been a good experience for Duke, and around 1976 he was trying again. But his first film had not made him rich, so he had to get creative in order to keep going on the next project, which was ultimately called Gone with the Pope. The production kept running out of money, so it was shot piecemeal and under different names so that Duke could start new tabs with labs and rental houses where he already owed money. Gone with the Pope seemed to be just Duke and a bunch of non-acting paisans this time, and some of the crew were right out of high school, and it just kept getting leaner. After Duke fired his sound man, he made the DP double on audio while shooting. But as a lounge act, Duke had access to a bunch of nightclubs as shooting locations, and as with the previous film, he could use his own songs on the soundtrack. And by this point, Duke's son, Jeffrey Mitchell, had become a working rock guitarist in Europe, and Jeff made available to the film some of his music, including the monster track Jackknife, which, with any cosmic fairness in the universe, that would have been a hit record the world over. But these assets and advantages weren't enough to keep momentum going through the editing process, and Duke sorta abandoned the film after it was shot, choosing instead to work on a Jimmy Durante tribute of all things. Duke Mitchell died in 1981, and sadly he left Gone with the Pope unfinished. Okay, fast forward more than a decade, and successful motion picture editor Bob Murawski discovered the gory pleasures of Massacre Mafia Style thanks to a VHS copy owned by cult film director William Lustig. Murawski then met Duke's son and learned about this unfinished second crime movie. He made it his mission over the next 15 years to reconstruct the film, working with the blessing of Jeff Mitchell. It premiered, Gone with the Pope premiered at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood in 2010. Almost 35 years after it had been shot. As expected, Gone with the Pope, it's a bit all over the place. The episodic story has Duke's character being sprung from prison ahead of his cellmates and being immediately ordered by the Chicago mob to perform a contract on 7 men. By the time that's completed, his old prison pals are out, and they decide their best chance for a good life is to live on international waters. Somehow, that becomes a plot to cross the Atlantic, kidnap the Pope, and ransom His Holiness to all the Catholics of the world at 50 cents a head. It is some wild and woolly stuff, peoples. The final film we'll be looking at is also from around 1976, and it's ironic that it was originally viewed as a regional movie, considering it's the best acted of this whole group, and it's the one that actually launched mainstream Hollywood careers. Yeah, this little New Jersey mafia film, Death Collector, also known as Family Enforcer, got unknowns Joe Pesci and Frank Vincent cast in Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull. Neither Pesci nor Vincent had ever acted in a film prior to Death Collector, but they had been in a musical comedy act together. So Death Collector led to Raging Bull, led to a whole string of Scorsese films together for the duo. But it also led to a great Hollywood career for star Joe Cortese, who more recently was in the Oscar-winning Green Book. Cortese is a great example of independent film's freedom in casting. Like some New Jersey independent filmmakers, they're doing a mafia film, they can say, hey, let's get little Joey Cortese from Patterson, I hear he can act. Whereas a studio film like The Dawn is Dead is more beholden to working with established stars, whether they really fit or not. Sure, The Dawn is Dead was able to nick character actors Abe Vigoda and Al Lettieri from The Godfather, but the two stars of the film, the two leads, Robert Forster and Frederick Forrest, they look as if they have their hair dyed jet black in order to look more the part. In any case, Death Collector concerns a wise guy who keeps doing work for the mob until he has some money tucked away, then retiring for a while. But when he comes back this time, he finds the local crime boss doesn't like his little vacations, and so he gets stuck doing low-level collections work. He eventually moves his way up to doing a grocery store robbery with Joe Pesci's character, but everything goes disastrously wrong. Joe Cortese is really great in this, and you know that little Mafia movie trope of a conversation being overly polite when the audience just knows it's going to turn threatening any second? Well, that type of scene is basically perfected here. Director Ralph DeVito attempted a second film, Anna, several years later. It was going to star Joe Pesci and silent film star Lillian Roth. Now, Roth was already replacing another star from old Hollywood, Joan Blondell, who had recently died. But shortly into the shooting, Roth suffered a stroke, and then she died. The film was never completed, and Death Collector remains the only directing credit of Ralph DeVito. But that one credit is a great one, and it deserves a real release instead of all the eyesore budget DVDs junking up drugstore bargain bins. So those are the 6 American films from the 70s that meet my indie mafia criteria. And before you go commenting, if you got this far, that I missed a bunch of blaxploitation films, well, I know that mafiosi appeared as villains in other genres of film, but that's not what we're discussing here now, are we, dum-dum? In the 80s and 90s, the Hollywood studios would get in the swing of making gangster epics again. Not sure what took so long, because in rewatching all these recently, I'm really struck by how inexpensive it can be to make a mafia picture, as so much of the tension is dialogue-driven. Scheming, betraying, double-crossing, unlike the cop pictures where tension is much more action-driven. High-speed vehicular pursuits, whatnot. By that logic, America should have made many more times mafia films than cop films. And provided you got talented actors, the films could be legitimately great, like Death Collector. But for whatever reason, they just... Hey, this is a closed set. Is this somebody you invited? Is this your ride? Is this... Does anybody... This isn't that guy that called, was it? Hey, you get the fuck out of here! You get the... God damn it!